Hi, and welcome to She Said, She Said. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan. I'm so happy to have you here. Today we're talking about a very timely topic, voting, and what it means for a representative democracy like ours. My guest today is the amazing Kim Wehle. Kim is a constitutional law professor. She's a scholar in the area of separation of powers. She's been an assistant U.S. attorney, practiced law, done a number of different things in her career, but she's made this notion of civic literacy and helping people who should know about these topics, helping to educate us in a way that maybe we're not getting this in school. It's become her passion and her calling, and we'll talk to Kim about what we should know. She is also the author of two fabulous books, including this one, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why. It comes on the heels of an earlier book that she wrote that really got her started on this work of really educating the populace more broadly about civics. The earlier book is called How to Read the Constitution and Why. I'm very excited to have Kim join us today. Kim, welcome to She Said, She Said.
Thank you, Laura. So happy to be here.
So happy to have you. So happy to have you. Congratulations on the book.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're in now week 2 and hoping to get it in people's hands because November is coming up around the corner, as we know.
Yeah.
And today's a huge day in Kentucky and New York.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you are really essentially sounding an alarm bell with this book. Talk about what your concerns are and really the message that you're trying to get across to people.
Well, my concerns are that, voter registration and participation is down. We saw in Kentucky, even the number of people that asked for mail-in ballots, a lot of them didn't send them in. And we are in a moment where democracy itself, in my view, is on the ballot in November. We are slipping into something that looks more like authoritarianism. And whether you like the current occupant of the White House or not, the office itself, the limits on the White House power have shifted. And so I think it's really important to send a very strong message to all our political leaders across the ideological spectrum, from federal to state to local, that government by we the people is still very strong, and it's individual voters that matter. But we have a crisis of civic literacy in this country, and people are apathetic about voting, and I'm trying to shift that by education, the importance of it, and just the logistics of it. The book walks through all the logistics for all 50 states.
Yeah. Why did you sort of take this particular tack? This is an interesting approach, right? People may see this and say, okay, I've been voting for 30 years. Why do I need this book? Because this is not a book written for kids. This is a book written for everyone. There's a lot of stuff that's in here. So why this particular approach?
Well, I've been teaching law now since 2006, and I tend to teach the kind of headier, complex constitutional type classes. And what I found over the years is people coming into law school there's an assumption they know really basic things, like what's the difference between a case and a piece of legislation. And I've learned you can't assume any of that coming in, even to law school. So I break all of it down into basics for my first years, and just decided it's time to bring that sort of common sense outside of the law school classroom and not assume people know these things, because if it's not really broken down and explained, you pick stuff up, but you really can't explain, for example, oh, I need to change my voter registration. What do I do? Most people can't answer something that basic. So as you know, last summer I launched What You Need to Know, or How to Read the Constitution and Why. So it has constitutional basics. And then after writing that book, I realized all of our government really comes down to the ballot box. I mean, it all roads point to the same center, which is voting, and it's confusing and complicated in this country, and we have such low turnout that my view is that step one to changing that is basic education.
Yeah, I suspect too, some people will pick up this book or see the title and they'll say, okay, this is a partisan attempt to encourage, to sort of take a particular position on one side of the political aisle or the other. Talk about the approach that you took in this book and why it's not a partisan exercise.
Yeah, I was really careful, and it's important to me to reach people across the political spectrum. I believe that it's not government by we the Democrats or we the Republicans. It's government by we the people, and divisions within America, creating factions. That's what actually degrades democracy. So this is, like I tell my students, I can tell you how to ride a bike, but you have to get on the bike and ride it yourself. And maybe you'll stumble, maybe you'll tip over a few times. This book has the basics, so regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, you can get on the bike and ride the bike and make your own decisions. I think most people don't like to be talked at and told what to think. My objective with these series of books, and I hope to continue it, is to help people learn how to think. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I mean, law school does teach people how to break concepts down, how to gather information on both sides, how to wrestle with ambiguity, gray areas. And there's a lot of gray in our voting system. There's a lot of issues that aren't quite black and white. And I bristle, it's understandable, but I bristle a lot at our culture's knee-jerk reaction to try to put someone in the red bucket or the blue bucket. I kind of want to be in the America bucket, and we can agree to disagree on things, but still find some common ground as Americans.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Talk a little bit about why this notion of voter turnout has become such a partisan issue, or perceived to be a partisan issue, I should say.
Right. Well, I mean, historically, just to back up a little bit, most democracies on the planet are opt-out democracies. That is, everyone's automatically registered. You get your card from the government, and you have to make a concerted effort to get out of that process. In America, it's the opposite. We opt in. And that stems in part from the fact that when the Constitution was ratified, only wealthy male white landowners could vote. That's how the original Constitution was set up. And so over the years, with various amendments and the Voting Rights Act, the tent has been opened, but it still is this sense of who are the right people to have the right to vote. Like that sort of informs the entire process. And there's a belief and that keeping people home from the polls is one way to win elections. And I say this because it was one of the tactics in 2016 that Vladimir Putin and the Russian bots utilized, planting false evidence to make people mad at each other, Americans divided, and to keep people angry and home from the polls. That's a way for outside forces, they believe, to win elections. And so, I think we are, unfortunately, as Americans, swimming against the tide to protect our right to vote. There's a lot of ways that make it hard to have it actually work. And my message is it's worth it. Just like you take your kids and you get them their flu shots, even though they don't want to go. This is that important, not just for ourselves and where we are on, in what we care about right now and in issues. I believe we care about climate change, immigration reform, the economy, wherever you are. None of that matters if you can't really vote. That's number one. So all of those issues they hinge on a functioning electoral process, number one. But number two is, my kids can't. I have a couple kids that can't vote, but I have 2 kids, I have 4 kids, 2 kids who can't vote. So I really feel like to create the world and the country and the environment that I want for my children, I need to participate now because they are disenfranchised by virtue of their age. So I think it's a real ethical, moral, and also as a mother, an obligation to participate in our democracy. And I really don't have a view on where people are as far as who they vote for. I do believe that if the numbers were not 50 or 55%, but 85 or 90% of participation, politicians would start listening more to individual people and less to, big money and dark money, which is really flooded politics.
Yeah. You cover literally soup to nuts in this book, but arguably much of this is information that we should be learning in school when we study civics, when we study history. And while some of it presumably is taught, much of it isn't. Let's talk about maybe how we got to this point and what you see as potentially some solutions as we think about starting younger, right? It's great to say for folks like us who've been voting for a while, we can learn some things that we didn't know or have a refresher on that. but our kids are not necessarily learning what's in this book that really is so essential. So what would you do about that?
Well, I mean, the step one is obviously to write the book and get it on people's shelves or get it in schools. I was really happy to hear from a friend whose child is in a private school in Washington that it's on the summer reading list. My last book, How to Read the Constitution and Why. I think it's also modeling. So creating an environment in the home where we're modeling not just voting, but educating ourselves about the issues. One of the classes I taught this semester at American University was a seminar about issues relating to democracy and the Constitution. And what I had the students do is read op-eds from various sources on every legal topic. And it was really eye-opening for them. They said, I've never read so many opinions on things. And it really shifted not so much what they thought, but how they thought about things. I mean, I did sort of at the end of the semester, we did a little roundtable. What did you get out of this? And they said, this is the first time I've been able to come to the table and talk about these hard issues and not feel vulnerable, not feel attacked, not feel like I had to pigeonhole someone. It was sort of, someone said something like it was identifying the criteria to get to an outcome rather than starting at the outcome. And so I think modeling a different approach to how we think about hard problems in the home is very important. And, education itself, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I do know there's critiques of No Child Left Behind, right, which was legislation that came out under the Bush administration that had very good aims, which was to get everyone's level, every child's level of basic education up to a certain point. But it focuses on math and reading to the exclusion of other disciplines, and it's very content based. Like I tell my students, if you can Wikipedia the answer, no one is going to hire you as a lawyer to figure out the answer.
Right.
How you think about it, not what the answer is. If the answer is, no one's going to pay you $1,000 an hour in Washington, right?
Right.
And so it's I think trying to shift the conversation around outcomes and putting ourselves in one camp or another, and how to think about these things and recognizing there's common ground. And these are gray areas. They're thorny. They are not black and white. So when we try to think about it black and white, I think the debate's over because it glosses over the ambiguity. So I'm really committed to trying to start this dialogue and encourage this dialogue around basic civic literacy.
Yeah. I've heard stories about teachers, particularly in public schools, that are really concerned about talking about politics, talking about civics, because we are so polarized in our politics right now that if you're not really prepared for all the places where those conversations are likely to go, it can be thorny. And so that they're, in some respects, maybe a bit of a default to say, I'm just not going to deal with that, because they're worried about how you have that conversation. How do you create the environment in your classroom, whether it's in the law school classroom like you're doing, or in high school civics class? How do you do that, Kim, so that you really get the benefit of all points of view and you're treating each other fairly and equitably, but you have a robust exchange of views and opinions? How do you create that environment?
Well, I mean, I do it a few ways. One of my tricks is to break the students into small groups. So I'll pose a question and it'll be kind of a neutral, non-political. It won't be, well, do you like X politician or not? And then they have to talk about it with each other. And so they develop kind of a relationship with 2 or 3 other people. Then they're brought to the larger classroom, and they have some buy-in to the people they spoke to. Because I think that it's easy to alienate people or easy to get angry when you don't have an actual face-to-face personal relationship. It's a little easier. So that is one thing. The other thing that I am, when comments are made that could be taken one way or the other, I tend to reframe them. So I make a real point of whatever the contribution is made in the class, I will figure out a way to have a dialogue with that student where we can agree on something that student said that could be taken to the whole class, right? So if it's something that is politically maybe insensitive, I might ask it a different way, get them to a place where they feel comfortable that other people would not disagree with that. And then we use that as a springboard. Again, I think you have to have some courage as a teacher to dive in there and actually manage, I manage the classroom. One of my first jobs out of law school was working for a federal judge. This was during the O.J. Simpson trial, and watching how that was a complete chaos. And my judge, he ran a tight courtroom. It's people, you knew who was in charge. And I think that sense of, okay, someone is in here managing this, takes the tension level way down, because the students don't feel they have to get their backs up and protect themselves and their point of view. So I think having, at least from my experience, that's a big difference. The other thing is having people read different points of view that are empirically based, evidence-based. I've done this conversation a few times about this book, and oftentimes people will call in and say, well, what about, non-citizens voting? That's a real problem, fraud. And if there's evidence of that, I think I agree it's a very serious problem. And so I'll credit that. For example, I do think that'd be a serious problem. There just isn't the evidence of that. So we have to start the conversation based on actual facts, and then deal with, in a matter of triage, what are the biggest problems to voting? That's not it, right? There are other huge problems in the electoral process. I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but let's prioritize. We do it as parents all the time, right? We decide, okay, pick my battle with my kid in terms of where I'm going to draw the line. And this is one of those. So I think these are just little tactics. We use our common sense, try to bring people into dialogue, use compassion, and just model that we're not going to just go for the dog whistles on either side of the aisle. I just don't do that. And it doesn't happen, frankly, Laura, in my classes. It's never been a problem.
It's so interesting because you do hear these concerns from an awful lot of teachers, and it's, the environment is very, very challenging, but I think it's good advice, and something that frankly we can all take to heart. So this latest book comes on the heels of an earlier book that you wrote focused on what we need to know to read the Constitution, what we should know and why. And the exact title, which I want to make sure that I get exactly right, How to Read the Constitution and Why. So talk about, that was your first sort of foray, I think, into simplifying civics, in sort of the first topic that you were focused on. So talk about why you started there and what you were trying to accomplish with that book.
Yeah, so I was reading the New York Times one summer a few years ago. I think maybe it was 2018. And there was a statement in one of the articles about the pardon power, the president's pardon power. And the statement was, the pardon power is absolute. There are no limits on the pardon power. That's just not fully accurate. I mean, all of the Constitution is contextual, and there's balancing tests everywhere. So I wrote my first op-ed, basically clarifying how to think about this, that you can't just have, the Constitution isn't black and white. I mean, you can't enslave people. There are a few things that are black and white. Mm-hmm. And I was under a contract to write a very scholarly book for Cambridge on outsourcing in the Constitution. When you use private contractors to perform government acts, what does the Constitution have to say about it? And I found myself, as I've started writing more op-eds, writing a different book. I'm like, this book is not written for other scholars. I'm starting to break down these ideas like I do in the classroom. So I got an agent, and Harper took the idea in 24 hours. I pitched it, and I mean, there's definitely, I think what I have found, even in, among highly educated people around Washington, the cocktail party or not, a lot of basic civics just isn't in people's vocabulary. And there's almost an embarrassment sometimes that it's not there. It wasn't taught, and it wasn't taught in a way that they can have that knowledge in their backpack and walk around with it. So my books are very much use common sense examples, lots of metaphors that make sense in your own life, that if you can't remember, this provision of the Constitution or this case, you can remember something like, you slow down if there's a speed camera hiding in the bushes. It's not the speed limit itself that manages your behavior. It's the consequence. The question with the government and the president isn't so much, can the president do that? But if the president does it, what's the consequence? If there's no consequence, the answer to the first question is yes. It's not so much what the law is. Mm-hmm. It's what's the consequence for violating the law? And if you're a parent, you know this. You can have a no eating in the living room rule, and you let your kid eat one time in the living room and there's no consequence, the rule is gone. The kid knows you're not serious about that and you're not going to enforce it. So who cares about the rule? It's exactly the same with the Constitution. I think that's a really eye-opening concept for a lot of people that they'll take away from the book, for example. So when you turn on the TV and it's, oh, this happened with Bill Barr, or this happened. Again, the question is, okay, well, if this is not okay, what's the consequence? If there's no consequence, that is the new normal. And that baton, that seat of power, that amount of power, the belt and suspenders of the office will go to the next president. So I really think Joe Biden, if he wins, is going to take on an office with a lot more power than Donald Trump had because of how this Congress has handled Donald Trump.
Interesting.
So that's where, again, Laura, I don't see this as a partisan question. It's a job description question,
right,
for Americans, for who gets to have the power to our own power to self-govern.
Yeah.
We're our own bosses in that regard, but not if we don't issue the ticket for speeding.
Yeah. You know, another area that I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, because of your background as an expert in separation of powers, is that the Supreme Court has become a very controversial body in the minds of an awful lot of people. And the reason why that has happened, I think, is very important, and it goes to the heart of your expertise. Lack of, one branch doing their job leads to, a significant impact on the decisions that are taken up and made. Talk a little bit about this shift that has occurred and why this has happened.
Well, yeah, that's much misunderstood. I mean, I think a lot of people want things to go to the Supreme Court. I'm not so much in that camp, because the Supreme Court construes the Constitution. It reads the language of the Constitution. Anyone who claims that there are good judges and bad judges based on how they read the Constitution doesn't understand, or is not admitting it's an old document. In my first book, I have a poem, and we as an example, different ways of reading language of a poem, language of the Bible. Constitution's the same way. You got to interpret it, right? So judges do that. But when you put a case before the United States Supreme Court that's under the Constitution, they read it, that's like amending the actual Constitution. The only way to change that reading is to change the configuration of the court, have them reverse themselves, or do a constitutional amendment, which would be 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 ratification of the states. It's set in stone. So I would rather see things happen in the legislature through legislation that we can change. If we don't like it, we can tweak it. We can, elect leaders in there that are politicians that are going to change the legislation. And what's happened, I think, in part, is that the Congress, due to this divisive party politics over country that I think has taken hold starting in the 90s, is not doing its job anymore. And we're also seeing a lot of critique, understandably, of the rise of the bureaucracy and the regulatory state, and agencies have too much power. Well, they're doing that because they have to fill in the blanks of Congress when Congress isn't doing the work. DACA, we saw this with Obama. We had a big decision last week, a lot of critique of DACA. That, in part, the president stepped in because Congress wasn't doing it. So I think the breakdown of Congress, which is a whole conversation we can have, has a lot to do with why the power is shifting to the other two branches of government. And that's really a problem, because Congress is, in theory, the most representative body of all three. It's bipartisan. They're there to represent individual constituents from both sides of the aisle, and they're stuck. They're not compromised, just like in the classrooms you're talking about. Compromise, reaching across the aisle, making deals is somehow now perceived as weak. But of course, that's how our whole system is based.
Right.
The framers, that's the whole deal. And so what I tell people, if you're red, you're blue, in a primary, find the moderate that's going to make deals and reach across the aisle. Find the one that's willing to work with a reasonable person, regardless of political party. That's what's going to get the country going. If you get locked in, far left or far right ideology, we're stuck. And then we'll see the Supreme Court picking stuff up where I agree they shouldn't be doing it. But I don't think it's fair to say there are good and bad judges on the Supreme Court. That I just don't think is correct.
Mhm, mhm. Putting them in the position of essentially having to be an additional legislative body is in and of itself sort of a misunderstanding of what it is that their job is to do, is what you're saying. And I think that's a really important element that is lost on an awful lot of people. And when they see decisions coming down, they're reading it as if it had come from a legislative body as opposed to the Supreme Court. And so at a very basic level, there's just not that understanding.
Yeah, and it does in effect function as legislation in that it's the highest statement of law in the country on something. But it's very different conceptually. And I explain to my students, difference between legislation and a court case. Legislation is prospective. We are going to pass a law that affects the future, and it's generalized, all people in the future. So a good policymaker takes into account all the implications of legislation in the future on a huge population. Cases are the exact opposite. It's retrospective. There's a fight that happened in the past, and the judges are supposed to decide who wins that particular fight. And it's very discrete. It's two parties. And so they're just deciding how to resolve that dispute in the past regarding these two parties. But it has implications. You have to then read the tea leaves of that decision and apply it to new situations like a legislature. It's fundamentally a different exercise. But as you indicate, because the Supreme Court, I think, is getting cases they shouldn't, they always have, and it's an important body. But there are things that could be done in the legislature that's not happening. And I think that would be much, much better for the American public to have legislatures actually start working and let the courts just really resolve disputes between individual parties and not make these sweeping decisions that affect all Americans, because they're not representative. These people are there for life. And now with the filibuster for Supreme Court judges and federal judges being killed, by politicians in Congress, we have people on the court like Brett Kavanaugh, who I respect. I mean, I've known him for years. This isn't a critique of him personally, but people who are on there with half of the population feeling and legitimately feeling disenfranchised from that appointment, right? So they don't buy into the legitimacy of the court. That's a problem. But that again goes back to the Congress, right, and how they're doing their business.
Right, absolutely. I want to dig into back to the topic of voting and a couple of areas that I think are sort of interesting. One is an idea that is being put forth in certain circles around this notion of ranked choice voting and what that means. I'd love for you to sort of give us a little bit of a discussion. And then I want to shift and talk about the Electoral College, because I think it's so misunderstood. So on ranked choice voting, this is an idea that's gotten some life in some circles. Talk about what that means and what impact that might have.
Right. So both of those, actually, I'm glad you brought them up in one question, because I do think they're related. And it's about how you count votes, both of them. So normally we will go into the ballot box, and we have this two-party system, Democrats, Republicans. That's not in the Constitution, by the way, but it's taken over politics. And you get two choices, and it's all or nothing. You put all your eggs in this basket or all your eggs in that basket. If you don't like either of the options, some people feel really like, I don't want to vote because these are terrible options, and why is this my only choice? Ranked choice voting is used in other parts of the world, in other democracies. It basically allows you to list the people that you would be okay with by order of preference. And you can pick from both sides of the aisle. So you might say, here's my first, second, third, fourth, fifth choice. And then all of the ballots are counted up for all five. And then you cross out the lowest, the loser, the person who gets the least amount of votes. They're then off the ballot. And then you keep doing that calculus until you basically get to options that are there's buy-in from both sides of the aisle, because everybody kind of like these people the best. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like weighing in on, liking something on Instagram. And so there are benefits to that, in part because it brings everyone to the table. You're not sort of disenfranchised if your candidate just didn't get enough and you feel frustrated. You have buy-in across in the entire process. So even if it's not your first choice, you got somebody on there that you like. It allows, as I indicated earlier, I think finding more moderate candidates is probably a good thing for democracy, so that we can get some more deals done in the Congress and at the state level. So it also allows, it allows more options in terms of just moderate candidates crossing the aisle. So some of the problems with it, I mean, there are pockets in the United States that are using it. It's just, it takes some skill and expertise and experience to actually have this executed properly, and you have to wait a little longer to get the answer. And we have this knee jerk, we want on election night to know who won. That might change, because I think with COVID and mail-in voting, it's going to take longer to vote to actually count ballots. So maybe that'll shift. So that's ranked choice voting. But it just shows if you tweak at the state level how things are done, you can have big impacts without a constitutional amendment, without going to the Supreme Court, without these big sweeping changes. The Electoral College was created by the framers because they were worried about small states basically being gobbled up by the federal government and being outshined by the larger states. So it's a way of kind of like every state gets 2 senators regardless of size. Also, just we don't want the little guys to be snuffed out, because remember, back then it was we the New Yorkers or the Virginians. They were really, really loyal to their state. The problem again with the Electoral College is how you count the votes. In most states, it's a winner-take-all system. So let me give an example. Say you have a state that gets 10 electors. So it's the electors that actually cast the votes for president. That's the difference between the Electoral College and the popular vote. And under most states, the electors go along with the popular vote. The theory is that they can do on what they can think independently, but they don't really think independently. I mean, that was the framers' theory. They basically just cast based on what the popular vote is. However, if you've got 10 electors for one state, and you've got 60% who voted for Joe Biden, 40% who voted for Donald Trump, all 10 electors in most states have to vote for Joe Biden in the Electoral College. Another alternative would be proportionate voting. 6 go for Joe Biden, 4 go for Donald Trump. Then when they're casting votes for the presidency, the Electoral College actually mirrors the popular vote. With a winner-take-all system, all of the electors go, so long as someone gets 51% of the vote, they get all those electors. That's where the disconnect happens.
I see.
And so people who voted for the losing candidate in your state feel disenfranchised. And when there's narrow margins in the popular vote, you see this, 4 times in our history, where the Electoral College goes a different direction, because in most states, whoever won got all the electoral votes, even though they didn't get all the popular votes percentage-wise. So that's something that can be tweaked at a state level through your state legislature. We can keep the Electoral College and not have, again, another reason for Americans to be mad at each other. I mean, that's one of my objectives, Laura. Let's just take some of this stuff off the table that we don't have to fight about and be mad at each other about. We can fix it in a rational way. Let's have elections that actually work, right? That we don't have fraud, but it's not so hard to actually vote. That takes political will, it takes money. But I would love it if people could just not fight about legitimacy of elections. Let's let everybody who can vote safely and securely, and then have real policy debates about serious issues that are going to affect our children in the future.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about technology, Kim, and the fact that we are still in the midst of COVID. You know, there are loosening guidelines where we can get out and about, but still with masks and things like that. I'm recording this podcast remotely still, and probably will be for some time. When people go to the polls in November, it's going to look potentially very different from the way it has in the past. Talk a little bit about your thoughts on technology, on mail-in ballots, kind of what we're looking at over the course of the next few months.
Well, today's a great day to ask that question because, of course, people in Kentucky are going to the polls today for their primary.
And hopefully I'll get this. So we're recording on Tuesday, June 23rd, and I'll hopefully get the conversation up either later this afternoon, but more likely tomorrow morning on Wednesday. So people listening will have, yeah.
So this week we've seen people go to the polls in Kentucky for the primary, 750,000 residents for a single polling place, right? And just imagine the logistics of that, and that's due to COVID.
Right.
So the polling places, as we saw in Wisconsin, we saw it in Georgia, there are going to be long lines because they don't have the poll workers, because of just the date, for various reasons. Some of it is actual, nefarious voter suppression. That's why we're seeing this push for mail-in voting. But even with that, we have a postal service that's running out of money. The postal service is slower than usual. You might not get your mail-in ballot. So I think, this is just one of those things. Every American who's eligible to vote has to take this into their own hands, kind of like, you pack up your backpack with, the granola bars and drinks for your kids, right? Because you might be gone for the day. You have to ask for your mail-in ballot, and there is no real serious evidence of fraud. So the president is just wrong on that, and so that needs to be set aside. Ask for your mail-in ballot. Every state but 5, I think now, you can do it based on COVID and get one. Get it in the mail. Actually cast your ballot as soon as you get it. If that doesn't work, if you don't get it in time, I think check on the Secretary of State's website for your state that has the most accurate information. It's in my book as well, but these things are changing. It's also on my website, the COVID Changes, kimwehle.com. But get on your Secretary's state website, see if your polls are open early. Go to the polls with your, hand sanitizer and your mask. Barring that, I think we're going to have to just plan to wait in line in November. And what's really, I think, tragic about it is this choice between health and protecting your health and exercising your constitutional right to vote. And there are a lot of failures around that. I mean, the Brennan Center of Justice estimates we need $2 billion to have a good election in the fall that should come from the federal government. That legislation is not happening. One of the COVID bills gave the states $400 million, but that's not what they need. So a lot of the problems in our electoral system is just they don't have the money. It's been 2000. Last time the federal government gave serious money for equipment on election day was 2002. I mean, how many people are using a flip phone from 2002 in your personal lives?
Right.
I just think, Laura, this is a no-brainer. This should not be a hard thing. It should run like clockwork. We have the technology. We just don't have the political power and the political will to do it.
Yeah, it really is so incredibly basic. So, one of my areas of passion for a number of years has been getting more women engaged in politics and engaging civically. I'm curious if you've ever thought about running for political office, or maybe rather than putting you on the spot, so I didn't mean to do that, but also like how you look at the data around women's engagement generally and kind of how that breaks down, how voting breaks down along gender lines, if you have that data or some sense of it.
Yeah, I don't have that data at my fingertips, but I do know, one of the big constituents in this particular election that is shifting, I think, in the Republican side, as far as I understand, are women, and that women are shifting away from traditionally, I shouldn't say traditionally, Donald Trump in particular. And if you were to drive down my street, I have 4 daughters, and they pulled out of a dumpster a literally giant blue and white banner that says "Vote for More Women," and they pull it out of the garage every time there's an election. They're like, "Mom, you can't take it down." I mean, I do think women, just from a personal anecdotal level, I think we think differently. We're collaborators. We're problem solvers. Our brains are wired in a way that we can juggle a lot of stuff at once and manage it. We can prioritize, and we can do things with passion and communication and understanding. I don't mean to say every woman's like that or men aren't, but I do think this is one sort of another easy way. It's not a one size fits all, but getting more women in politics, we might see things change just by virtue of the personality and the way women are we're consensus builders, and again, I'll probably get in trouble for sounding very gendered, but I'm a believer in that as one way, I think, to just shift the energy around this, which is so stuck and causing so many intractable problems. But people can get involved without actually running for office. If you get one person who's not voted before registered today or this week or next week, if we all did that, we'd go from 50% of eligible voters to a much higher number. So you could have an impact, just call grandma or Aunt Laura, Lorraine, or your next door neighbor or your colleague and get that going. Right. We can make an impact. And I think dialing into our instincts as mothers, frankly, which is a big part of my identity, really drives this work that I do.
Yeah, yeah. You have, I think it's fair to say, found your passion. You found these topics that just light you up inside. Talk about that journey to get to that point and how you knew this was the area that you wanted to focus on, because you've done a number of different jobs within the legal profession. Talk about how you found this calling.
Yeah, it definitely found me. I know that's a little bit cliche. But I've been a lawyer a long time, and then I've been teaching, which is a different way of thinking, right? Teaching is, since 2006, I've been teaching law students, and, I've taught at a range of schools and a range of people coming in with their backgrounds in terms of their educational backgrounds, their comfort level in a law school classroom. So I've had to figure out how to pitch things in a way that reaches lots of people. And without sacrificing content, without sacrificing the nuance, the theory, the complexities. So I did that for a long time. And then, and I've been writing, as you mentioned, the separation of powers, which just seems sort of wonky and boring. Now the separation of powers is sexy, right? Now everybody wants to talk about it. And so I just have this, it does feel like, okay, it's time. It's time to take these skills as a parent and as a teacher, translating complex, wonky stuff into digestible, understandable, sort of tools that people can use to think for themselves. And so, on a personal level, it's actually I've never talked about this publicly, but I also went through a really difficult divorce after 20 years of marriage and 4 children. And I think that definitely gave me this sense of, okay, I can do anything. I can do hard things, and people can disagree with me. That's okay. I don't need people to agree with me to have my own truth around these things. And I do think that those two things coming together at this point in my life has just given me the gas in the tank, so to speak,
Yeah.
to share my energy in a different direction.
Yeah. So when you think about the impact that you hope to have with this work, sort of looking back on it, what do you hope that will be?
Well, I do hope that this message gets bigger. I mean, I'd like to look back and see this notion of thinking, talking about how to think, and talking about and this sounds a bit cliche, but talking about, the importance of building blocks of education as a foundational concept. I would love to see some of these influencers, celebrities, people on social media that, social media gets such a bad rap, but let's face it, this is our world, to start capturing some of that technology, and our young people, and to make it cool to understand these things, to feel empowered, to understand this is the way to feel that you're empowered in your life, not to drag people down, and not to get angry, and not to have to, vilify others, and be in a pack, but to empower yourself, to use your own voice and to have your own tools. I would love to see one day, like, remember when Laura and I had that conversation, and then that conversation took on in various places. That would be my dream. But even doing this piece, frankly, I feel very proud to have this platform, to be participating in this very critical moment in our democracy. As I said, democracy is on the ballot. If you imagine yourself going to the polls in November, and on the ballot would be American democracy or something like North Korea. And I'm not saying that that's what we have right now. I'm just saying if that were theoretically the stark choice, and that we're going to make the impact, I really think people would find a way to get themselves registered and voting. If people understood that's what was at stake,
Right.
and I'm saying as a constitutional scholar, that is what's at stake. And to think in the rearview mirror, gosh, now the stormtroopers are at the back door, so to speak, for American democracy. What do I do? That's not the time. Now is the time to quit smoking, right? If you want to avoid some serious lung disease. I mean, we've heard this in other parts of our lives, and it's hard to capture this. The urgency of this, and it's not red and it's not blue, and it's much bigger than Donald Trump. It's much bigger than Joe Biden. It's much bigger than this Congress. It's about the American experiment. The framers thought they had 20 years of this. They didn't think it was going to work. We made a couple of centuries, but the last really thriving democracy, traditional democracy, was Athenian Greece 2,000 years ago. It took 2,000 years
Right.
to get it again with America. I don't want to I'm hanging on for dear life, Laura. I don't want to wait another 2,000 years.
Amen, sister. Beautiful. Kim, listen, thank you so much. This was terrific. I really loved the conversation. Appreciate
I
you
did
joining
too.
me.
I hope we can do it again.
To learn a bit more about Kim, check out the show notes for this episode, episode 110. I will include links to Kim's website, as well as links to both of her terrific books, her latest, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and her earlier book on the Constitution. As always, I'm so grateful that you took the time to join us. I hope you learned a few things, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode or any others. You'll find all of our content on the website at shesaidshesaispodcast.com. Take care.